So everyone, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Balshaw. Um, he is a assistant professor at the Max Rudy College of Medicine at the University of Manitoba, and his research interests include innovative clinical trial design, causal inference in observational studies, models for longitudinal and life history data, and methods for biomarker discovery, refinement, and validation. And he has graciously agreed to speak to the Canadian Transfusion Trials Group on the current standards for good statistical practice in clinical trial design, and is going to be spending some time talking about common pitfalls encountered by trainees and early career investigators. So Rob, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
All right, my pleasure. I thank you for the invitation. Thanks everybody for joining us. When we were just getting started, I smiled and said that I operate at just above the stupid, and I hope this doesn't come across as too rudimentary a discussion of the topics that we'll cover today. And in fact, I wasn't exactly certain what the audience was. That's on me. I should have inquired a little bit more deeply and made better notes when I chatted with you guys earlier. Um, yeah, I hope my background is I'm a clinical trialist, but a consulting statistician first. So I work best when people interrupt me and ask me questions and argue with me. So please, if anybody has thoughts as we're going through this, if they've got things they'd like to pursue, like me to say a little bit more about, please let me know. Okay, and I'm going to. I'm in. Also mentioned as we were getting started that we've moved into a new house and my computer setup is still relatively new, so I'm just getting things going with a fresh computer here. So I'm going to endeavor to share, uh, and it looks like allow Zoom to, okay, here we go. Zoom, share, there we go, new computer.
Hmm.
Sorry, hold tight. Oh, and it's going to ask me to quit and reopen. My apologies, guys. I will be back in a minute and a half.
No trouble, Rob.
Okay. All right, so I'm back.
Okay.
You guys are there. Good. All right, thank you. And I will now try again to share my screen. That looks promising. Okay. So you'll
Success.
see the clutter for a moment and then my presentation. Here we go. Are we doing okay?
Looks great. It's
All right,
perfect.
thank you. All right, so yeah, just to reiterate the I wanted to talk about broadly speaking statistical considerations in clinical trials, and I thought the most the pointy part of the presentation is sort of on the terminology associated with the Estimand framework. And just to sort of steal my own thunder, I'm going to basically try to convince you folks that if you're new to the Estimand framework, or if the terminology is just only coming onto your radar now, it's really not rocket science in any special way, but it is a really nice collection of thoughts and tools to help you have increase the rigor with which we design our clinical trials, the way we ask the questions of our clinical trials, to ensure that the answers we get from those clinical trials are as efficient and effective as they can be. So that's the whole point of the talk. It's I hope it will be both familiar and not intimidating at all. And please, as I've said, just interrupt me, ask me questions. Not knowing exactly how long it was going to take, how much discussion there would be, I included what I consider my sort of boilerplate. I have a collection of slides that have linked topics in clinical trials. So if along the way people are asking questions that take us down a sort of winding path of other statistical ideas, I'm more than happy to pursue those paths. So ask questions, and it'll be an even more interesting conversation, I think. So I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, the traditional one at the University of Manitoba. The U of M campuses where I work and live, or near where I live, are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Assiniboine, Dakota, Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. And we at the University of Manitoba respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So just to motivate these discussions, I wanted to say, okay, Santa's got a problem. I believe that I sent out some links to some papers, and one of those papers was called "All I Want for Christmas is a More Precise Research Question." And Santa's research question is that he thinks that his reindeer, who eat carrots, get tired more easily than those that eat homemade mince pies as their pre-flight meal. And this paper obviously came out just before Christmas, as I was planning my talk and thinking about the Estimand framework, and it was just kind of good timing. So I grabbed onto it and suggested this as one of the papers we could sort of center the discussion around. So this Christmas themed question was, does randomly assigned pre-flight meal affect performance? And as soon as we say something like that and we start thinking, yeah, I can imagine there's a clinical trial. We've gotten access to 9 reindeer. We can consider those as our the participants in our study. I hope that our clinical trial experience has led us to think, wait a second, what meals are we going to compare? How are we going to measure performance? Because we clearly want to establish which of the pre-flight meals leads to the best performance. And how are we going to compare these measurements between the meals, the groups? So we need to get into the details of how do we design this study in such a way that it's most effective. And the plan for today is we'll just kind of review the ideas from this Crow and Phillips paper. It's a very light read, and I think it does a really nice job of making us aware that this ICH E9 framework, which is a dreary regulatory flavored guideline covering the Estimand framework and how it fits into clinical trials, the main analyses, and perhaps even more usefully into the sensitivity analyses associated with clinical trials. That these are not crazy new ideas. They're just a framework around which we can build better clinical trials. So we'll also I anticipate we'll have time to spend a little bit of discussion among some key interconnected concepts that are associated with the Estimand framework, study design in general, and bits and pieces that are more specific as interest takes us. So the Estimand framework and how it is expressed in this Crow and Phillips article at the end of last year is about the idea of, if we want to design a clinical trial, if we need to understand precisely and rigorously what are the treatment conditions that we're comparing, what is the population in which the treatment effect is to be estimated, what outcome, or terminology varies, what endpoint is being measured on each of the participants, and what are the summary measures, what statistics, which gets into the statistical modeling perhaps, what summary measure will be used to compare the treatments. And a really important concept that is emphasized, or it really rises to prominence in the Estimand framework, is how do we handle intercurrent events? And I'm going to dig a little bit into what I mean, or what are meant by intercurrent events, because that really is, in my mind, that's the piece that is most intriguing about the Estimand framework. Okay, so an estimand it's the thing that we're trying to estimate. Statisticians classically, I was taught that the thing that we want to conduct inference about in a population is the parameter associated with the population. But that was language that was appropriate when I was looking at triple integrals and things. Nowadays, what we really want is we want to estimate something about an intervention. We want to estimate the base. Usually it's something like a treatment benefit or the impact of a risk factor. In this case, the estimand is the answer to a more precise question than just what's the effect, what's the difference, what is the impact on performance. So we need to take the time to very carefully and systematically go through what boils down to essentially 5 key questions. Precisely what are the treatment conditions that we're comparing? Precisely what population is the treatment effect being estimated for? What outcome or endpoint is being measured? What are the statistics? What summary measure will be used to compare the treatments? And how are we going to handle these intercurrent events? Okay, so we read through that just a moment ago. They feature prominently as a list of questions in both this paper and other papers that are about the Estimand framework. And like I say, this is if you've encountered the acronym PICO, and you're thinking, wait a second, this doesn't sound all that different. You're right. The PICO, patient or problem or population, intervention, the comparison, again, the intervention, the exposure, the risk factor, and the outcome, that framework covers almost the same collection of ideas, but perhaps it doesn't cover this idea of the intercurrent event with the same degree of emphasis. So what would that look like in Santa's reindeer experiment? He wants to compare a bundle of 5 carrots as his standard meal and comparing that with a homemade mince pie, Mrs. Santa's homemade mince pie. And he's going to randomly assign that to his 9 reindeer. And he needs to think through the details that the randomized to 5 carrots, randomized to a mince pie. The intercurrent event trick is that he needs to be aware that some of the reindeer might not eat all of the carrots. And reindeer 3 in this cartoon that they've put together, reindeer 3 isn't able to finish all 5 carrots. They only eat 1. So that's not quite what was planned. Reindeer 4 says to heck with the carrots and grabs one of the mince pies. And reindeer 5, partway along the route, ends up eating some of Santa's cookies that had been left out for him. And reindeer 6 sneaks some sherry that was left out. And each of these not as randomized, not as randomized, we'll use that language, not as randomized things, is certainly a cookie partway through the evening, or switching to minced pie, or having a sherry. None of those were part of the originally planned interventions. And those downstream from randomization intercurrent events are really the key element, in my mind, the key element of the Estimand framework that people are now starting to think about and to deal with carefully. And oh, there we are. I was supposed to walk my way through these various reindeer and the particular sequence of treatments and intercurrent events that they experienced. Okay, and this stuff is we're treating it fairly lightly here, and I hope that it is sounding. Maybe I'll just go back for a moment. I hope it is sounding reasonably familiar, because things like treatment intolerance, that the patient was supposed to receive a fairly large dose of steroids and could only tolerate a light dose. A patient who is, and forgive me, my own experience, many of the studies I've been involved with have been in transplant, kidney, renal transplant in particular. And the treatment, prevention and treatment of rejection is a pretty commonly studied area in that context. So something like a large dose of steroids to treat incipient rejection is a fairly common thing. Patients who are randomized to receive a large dose of steroids or a low dose of steroids, and they end up switching and receiving a large dose of steroids. Um, Patients who have apparently a lack of response to the original therapy, and they add an additional antibody treatment to the post-rejection treatment of rejection. That happens, and patients who are receiving therapies which are contraindicated for the particular condition and the other therapies that they're on. All of these are things that happened in randomized trials every day. My own experience is that if you've got more than 10 people, you'll see just about every possible protocol violation that is possible, that you can imagine, and a bunch that you haven't. And if you've got hundreds to thousands of individuals in a trial, you really are going to be dealing with all of these kinds of variations in the way that treatment has been administered, the way that treatment has been modified, the way that the patients have behaved, and the way that things have happened to the patients that need to be dealt with during their course of care. So this notion of intercurrent events is extremely common, and is the secret, I would call it the secret sauce to the whole the Estimand framework. Now, dealing with intercurrent events, anticipating them, and then specifying the way that they will be dealt with in the protocol is the critical piece here. So this from the Kahan paper that was referenced. Um, they list a series of strategies and just give a light set of definitional notions of what those treatment strategies might end up looking like. And something like the if a to deal with intercurrent events, the notion of a treatment policy is that things will happen in the trial and we need to deal with it. So the outcomes are used whether or not the intercurrent event occurred. And that, in my mind, is an awful lot like the thinking that we often encounter as an as randomized or an intention to treat kind of strategy for analysis. Then there's the idea that the intercurrent event may actually be considered part of the outcome. And again, in a kidney transplant trial, we might be trying to evaluate different immunotherapies that could be used post-transplant. And along the way to, well, we'd like to keep the patient alive. We'd like to keep them with a functioning graft. And we would also like to keep them with none of that hopefully treatable temporary rejection episode, which primes them for downstream problems. But those intercurrent events, the graft rejection, the graft failure, and ultimately death, how are we going to deal with all of those as intercurrent events along the way to the ultimate endpoint, the patient and graft survival? And classically, they've used things like composite events, prevention of any of the following, and that is absolutely one of the strategies that can be incorporated. Transplant, it has a long history of doing that kind of thinking, but in other studies, it's relevant as well. Another one is that we will look only at the outcomes that are assessed prior to the treatment, which is one of the strategies, and it really does change the way that it can have impact on the interpretation of the results, where they apply and how they can be interpreted. Others include the hypothetical strategy, which is that we're going to say that the outcome is estimated as though the intercurrent events did not occur, which is a sort of hypothetical setting and could lead to important changes in the way that the analysis is conducted. But and obviously how any results will be interpreted. And it's related to the idea of a principal strategy in which the outcome is assessed in those for whom the intercurrent events would not happen. That is, that the trial would be conducted only as though the trial could be conducted only in those for whom the treatment will ultimately be uh, planned to be used. So different principal stratum, and I'm just reading the little note here in the table. Participants who would not discontinue either the assigned treatment versus those who would not discontinue if assigned to the intervention. So it's a sort of a as though we could anticipate who will and will not have difficulties with the downstream treatment. So it is a hypothetical, or sorry, a notion of an idealized kind of population in which the study could be conducted. And I'm not able to connect. There we go. Whoop. So for Santa, they make reference to a statistical elf, which is helping Santa design and think about his trial. He might have suggested to his elf that what he'd like is Estimand #1, which will be measured as the average difference in a tiredness score, which will be the outcome that is measured on the reindeer, and it's comparing between eating a mince pie and a bunch of 5 carrots. So there's the quite clear statement of the treatment conditions for flying reindeers, and that's our population. And it's regardless of whether all carrots or mince pies are eaten, or if there's cheeky reindeers switching allocations, or sneaky reindeers eating other food, or bold reindeers indulging in Santa's sherry. And there's the intercurrent events, and it's the way that regardless of whether all of these things might or might not happen, that's leading us to think of this as a treatment policy strategy, which in my mind is quite similar to the classical, what I was sort of raised to think of as the intention to treat approach in a clinical trial. Estimand #2, Santa might have said, well, what I'd like to know is the average difference, again, that's the summary measure, in the tiredness score, our measure of outcome, between eating mince pie and a bunch of 5 carrots, again, the same treatment conditions for flying reindeers, same population, if all flying reindeers were to adhere to the allocated pre-flight meal and do not receive any additional foods or sherry. Okay, so that's not what will likely happen. And we've looked ahead and we've said, okay, so there's a reindeer that gets some sherry, there's a reindeer that eats some cookies. These things are not happening. Sorry, these things do happen, but we're going to try to think of our trial as one in which these intercurrent events are going to be dealt with through a hypothetical strategy, as if all flying reindeers adhere to the allocated pre-flight meal and do not have any follow-up intercurrent events, which in my mind sounds a little bit like the per protocol approach. Now, that's debatable, and it will change very much based on the different the different context that we might enter into. But those are terms that were familiar to me from my years working in clinical trials in industry. So those sort of analysis approaches, or we used to call them analysis sets, a per protocol analysis set, an intention to treat analysis set, terminology like that, which are really just being refocused on through the lens of the Estimand framework. Okay, so the take-homes from this really quick review of the various ideas associated with the Estimand framework is that if you become familiar with it, if you start to use it, you'll find that it improves the clarity of the questions that your trials are designed to address, and consequently, quite naturally, improve the quality of the results of those trials. It's a structured scaffolding which leads to increased rigor in both your protocols and the attachments, the statistical analysis plans, and how you do your study reporting. More and more more and more journals are even encouraging the documenting the study design through language associated with the Estimand framework. And really planning for intercurrent events, that's the piece that was not given the same emphasis in earlier frameworks and approaches to clinical trial design, or at least in the those conceptual frameworks like the PICO framework. So really, the intercurrent events, planning for them, anticipating them, talking about what strategy will be used for them is really the piece that is worth thinking about. Generally speaking, regulators are on board with this. It's sort of in the 2020, I believe. Health Canada and EMA adopted these from the ICH proposals that were out there. FDA was just a year behind. And so that they really, you'll be speaking regulatory approved language if you use the Estimand framework, which can be really helpful in just sort of greasing the skids, removing points of friction. And again, it's a quite rigorous set of language, a sort of subset of language, which means that the number of places where confusions can happen or can be controlled. And that's I don't know about you, but in my work, probably half of the issues that arise as we work through the details of planning a study, planning the analyses, conducting the analyses, and documenting what happened and how well things worked. It's because sometimes the terminology in various pieces is a little loose, and a tighter, more controlled language is almost always worth adopting. And just a note, it is not, this Estimand framework is not universally adored by the stats community. And one of the comments I heard was sort of that there's no help putting unclear ideas into a seemingly rigorous framework. Lipstick on a pig comes to mind. If the study design is if the study is poorly conceived, just shoving loose ideas into an Estimand framework are not going to rescue it, but it's certainly going to cause you to stop and, I've found that it causes you to stop and think and recognize that this idea that I thought I was clear on my population, but now that I actually start to write it out in the context of the Estimand framework, it's clear that I haven't really thought through all the details of my population. And again, the idea of the intercurrent event can be critical. As soon as you start to talk about, well, what could go off the rails as we go forward, and how are we going to deal with those? That's a really important piece. And yeah, so the other thing that the stats community, it's if people are putting these sort of floppy, ill-conceived ideas into what seems like a rigorous framework, they might just be doing the wrong thing and going wrong with confidence. They feel like they've adopted a rigorous framework, but they haven't put in the work to modify their loose ideas and take advantage of that rigorous framework. Okay, so just some resources for those who might want to go away and read a little bit more about this. Interesting. The Crow and Phillips paper is a quick read. I think it's 2.5 pages with a nice big figure in there and a couple little tables. It's an easy read and might make you smile. Mainly though, I think it'll just it'll convince you that, gosh, this stuff isn't all that complicated, and maybe I can take it away and use it in a study context. The Kahan paper in BMJ, again, likewise, a fairly light read, though it does get a little bit more technical, runs to about 4 or 5 pages, and it has, again, some nice examples of some conceptual trials and how they would be looked at through the Estimand framework. And if you're really into the details, the addendum on Estimands and sensitivity analysis in clinical trials to the guideline on statistical principles for clinical trial, E9R1, at the ICH, which is the same document that's been adopted by EMA, Health Canada, FDA. That is the source of all of this stuff, and there's also about a 300 slide training resource that's available if you or your team are interested in seeing how these ideas can be shared and taught with others in your organizations or teams. So just a really fast, and because I'm not seeing faces here, I hope, oh, and I see there's some chat coming up. Uh, the um, the couple of questions which I'll tackle now, and I'm delighted to see there's already a couple of questions, a couple of comments. So I'll just say thank you for your attention. Um, I have another. Well, I think you saw. I got a glimpse of it there. There's another collection of uh, uh, guidelines, related concepts and ideas. I often take this to, somebody says, "Hey, Rob, I will give you 90 minutes. Can you teach us clinical trials?" And I say, "Holy cow, why don't I come and answer questions about ideas in clinical trials that you guys may be familiar with?" So if anybody sees things up here that they'd like to ask about, and you'll notice the Estimand framework and reporting guidelines, protocol, all of those things are covered in here, and then they have downstream impact. So I'm happy to just indulge in a freewheeling discussion now, or dive back in and look at questions for the Estimand framework in particular. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, it's interesting. As you were presenting, I was reflecting on sort of what we do when we are critiquing papers and journal clubs and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And we take that PICO framework and we look at the uh, everything that kind of went wrong, with the trial, like how much confounding was there, how much contamination between arms was there,
Mhm.
what sort of co-interventions happened, that were unequally distributed and that sort of thing. And we tend to, pick apart the papers because none of them are perfect, as you say, and we generally say, okay, well, this one there was, maybe not perfect, allocation of different co-interventions, and the compliance was not 100%. But we don't, at the end of the day, there's kind of a gestalt of like, well, was it really bad, to the point where we don't believe the results, or do we just sort of, decide, well, it's, take that with a grain of salt or what have you. And similarly, when you're designing these trials, you go to enormous efforts to minimize those kind of things. We
Mhm.
go to great, pains to prevent, non-compliance, to prevent co-intervention and that unequally. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, with this sort of framework, the basic message seemed to me to be sort of like, stuff is going to go wrong. Just assume that the trial is not going to work out, and plan for that.
Yeah.
Incorporate that, not simply into the question that you're asking, but into the actual methodology by which you are going to be designing, the trial itself. Can you give sort of an example of sort of like scenario? If you say, I
So
know that some of these rangers are not going to eat all their carrots, what does that mean in terms of the statistical design and analysis?
um, well, I guess the Esteban framework does a really good job of making you confront that question, right? Like that's its real strength. Is it is as you start to specify what's the intervention, you start to think, wait a second, what are we going to do if it doesn't work out quite like that? And then what are we going to do if it turns out that stuff happens, which it always does? I was involved in one trial with it was an orphan indication. It was kidney function was one of the primary endpoints, and the very small number of patients, I think it was about 180 or 190 patients that we were able to around the world and recruit into this trial over like something like 10 or 11 years. It was We said we're going to consider um, we're going to stratify the patients on the basis of their baseline renal function and examine the impact of the drug on the decline in their renal function, stratified by those endpoint, stratified by their baseline, and it was so that's all good, but the complication came that some of the patients actually ended up going on dialysis within 2 weeks. They were so far down the slope. Went on dialysis within about 2 weeks of starting on the med. And everybody looked at each other and said, "Oh, well, okay, so yeah, I guess we could have anticipated that." Fortunately for me, I guess I wasn't involved in the design of the trial, but I don't know that I would have had the foresight then to plan for things like, well, what are we going to do if a patient goes on dialysis? Because all of a sudden, uh, at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 5 years, okay, we can anticipate there will be patients going on dialysis. There's patients that are going to lose their kidney. There's patients that are going to die. How are we going to deal with that? Okay, downstream, we've got a sort of survival analysis, life history kind of thinking. Well, what are we going to do if somebody ends up losing their kidney in the first 2 weeks, when there's really no conceivable way that the patient's kidney function could have been impacted in any meaningful way by this med? There was just this, and we had just to keep it interesting, we had an unbalanced number of patients who lost their kidney within the first 2 weeks. And as we tried to deal with that in a post hoc way, we tried to stick to our guns and say, well, look, we didn't say we were going to remove them. We'll include them. When we included them, the needle tilted towards an effective a p less than zero point 0. In that particular case, it was 0.025, p less than 0.025. So the regulatory agency, the FDA at that particular time, was saying, that's looking promising, but you had what was it, 7 patients lose kidney function in the placebo arm, and only 4 lose kidney function in the first 2 weeks in the treatment arm. And if we eliminate those, your p-value goes to 0.04. And we said, okay, fair, but hold on. And we argued for about a year. And how do we deal with that? And of course, the story has other complications associated with the small number of patients, the tracking them down in Eastern Europe using private eyes. I mean, it was a really kind of a crazy circumstance. But that change in the p-value, when this quite had we followed the Estimand framework, we would have anticipated that patients who lose their graft early, what are we going to do about them? What something that if they go on to dialysis within 3 or 4 days, clearly that's not associated with the med. If they go on to dialysis within a week to 10 days, still not. 14 days, no. Out at a month, okay. So those a 1 month endpoint is really part of what we wanted to measure, but a 1 week or a 2 week endpoint, the conversation could have gone very differently then. Similar things happen with when you're using treatments that where now the reindeer that couldn't stomach 5 carrots. That I'm one of those people who can't have a big breakfast right away, so I'm sensitive to the idea that I'd like something, but I don't want to eat the whole protein-based meal that they're wanting to test me on. So those kinds of things need to be anticipated, and depending on the point of the trial, a different intercurrent event handling strategy would be completely appropriate. Whether it's some people won't be able to take the full dose, we will treat that as a natural consequence, a real world sort of consequence of the impact of the treatment. Some patients don't get the full dose. Some patients have a nasty side effect and end up having to have a rescue med. Are we going to consider that as a natural consequence of the use of the med, or is that something that is patients who take too much, patients who use a contraindicated substance, they're going to be experiencing downstream events? Do we ascribe that to part of the effect that the estimand that we're working with? And again, thinking about each of these bits and pieces and how they connect together helps you understand, have I designed a study which is going to get at the estimand, the answer to the question that I really wanted to ask? Sorry, long answer to what was probably a simple question.
No, it's a complicated question, and I appreciate your answer. I Before I send any sort of follow-up questions, I'll open it up to the other audience members. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I know that Ryan, you had a comment in the chat there about unexpected protocol violations, and I was actually thinking about you and the emphasis on platform trials and adaptive trial design and that sort of thing, where it's, we're generally sort of, less obsessive about having completely clean, uh, you know, equalized co-interventions and that sort of thing. Like this is almost sort of the opposite here. We're saying, we need to sort of be able to incorporate all the noise and unexpected outcomes and co-interventions into the actual trial design. Ryan, how would you apply this kind of approach to an adaptive uh, platform trial?
Well, I was going to ask Rob that to some degree, but I don't think that anything we do in an adaptive platform trial changes with regard to the noise or the rigor at all. And I think that what's studied and how it's handled kind of depends on what it is and whether if it's a registration trial or not. Like those have specific rules, and they can still be done in a platform setting for which little flexibility is available. And adverse event reporting is a certain like sort of structure that is just not negotiable, versus the pragmatic comparative efficacy thing that could be rolled into it. And I prefer to do, but that's just my preference. And so I think that I'm not too worried about that. But I did have a question for Rob too. So how do I incorporate this into platform? Like I think about interactions all the time. I plan that a priori. I think all of this should be planned as a priori as possible. Even how you adapt, of course, of course. And how you deal with protocol violations should be planned
Mhm.
as a priori as possible too. Often, I have to say, for protocol deviations and violations, we often plan that before we do the analysis, but
Mhm.
often not while the trial is ongoing or before the trial. Like I'm not usually that organized, although maybe I should be. But we typically, like, even like for the recent trial, Rob and I submitted the SAP for, it's like you sort of do the SAP, statistical analytic plan, and you think about, oh, how will I deal with protocol deviations? Like, at least you're thinking about it before you see the data, but often I haven't been more prepared than that. I don't know.
I'm absolutely sympathetic to the the challenge. It's easier to run a pragmatic clinical trial. It's harder to run a pragmatic clinical trial. And I think the Estimand framework in a way is maybe a kind of well, I keep calling it a scaffolding. It can help to establish in this pragmatic clinical trial where we know shit happens. Let's talk about it and let's anticipate it so that when it does happen, nobody goes, well, boy, you should have thought of that. Because now that planned simple-minded analysis, which would have worked if these had been little white mice and there'd been a 7-day follow-up, it's now real people with real conditions, with complicated lives, and it's a 2-year follow-up. Okay, we got to deal with the fact that, reindeers nip into the sherry once in a while, and some of them will violate will eat rescue meds along the way, and that I think it means that the pragmatic trial can be made more, but any trial can be made more a priori, and the structure of these really just 5 good questions. How are we? What are we measuring? What is the intervention? Who are we studying? Those 5 questions cause you to stop and think a little bit more carefully. And you don't have to have adopting the framework doesn't mean that you're going to eliminate all of the intercurrent events. It's absolutely, it's kind of embracing them. It's
I think that,
anticipating that they will happen and that we're going to start to think about how to handle them as we go, as we get things rolling, not at the back end looking, thinking, geez, should have thought about patients who lose their kidneys within the first 14 days. Ah, damn.
I do think a lot of this, like, not like, I think it sounds like a criticism, but it's not. But I think it's more of a reassuring statement, like you made it at the beginning. Is like a lot of this is
Mhm.
rebranding. Like it's like how everyone rebrands themselves like once in a while for like learning health system or patient reported or stuff like that it's all good evolution because you're coming with a common lexicon and you are making iterative advances. So I think reassure everyone that this is not all new. This is somewhat packaging it a little bit differently with a little bit of,
Yes.
iterative evolution in the process. So that's one comment. And then my question is like, I think it would be really helpful if there was a guide for junior faculty or new investigators to apply, making up their grants about how to incorporate some of this into grant applications because
Mhm.
it's done really haphazardly. Like most people don't incorporate it at all, by the way, and then some people do, and it kind of sticks out weirdly, and then other people kind of do it well. And I think that a little bit of mentorship on how we might think about, incorporating these just guidance into grant
Mhm.
components could be really helpful. I'm just saying, like, as for some future tool.
Yeah, yeah. And your reassurance, Ryan, is absolutely on point. This is not new, this is not brand new thinking, but it's a slightly more structured and again, the PICO framework is, it's 99% the same thing as this structure, except for that 1%, and that 1% about anticipating intercurrent events and planning how you're going to deal with them. That's really the critical piece in the innovation, if you will, associated with this Estimand framework. There are statistical methodologists who have slightly more in-depth understanding of how the interplay between these pieces. But in my mind, yeah, we're really just coming up with uh, uh, a language to that, when Jacob and you are arguing, you'll be able to say, no, 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 you're talking about the population, and I want to talk about intercurrent events. And all of a sudden somebody's going to go, oh, whoa, whoa, oh, I see what you mean. And that's the key piece, is just to get the terminology and the slightly distinct ideas separated so that you can argue them through more carefully.
Yeah, I think it does make you sort of realize, it's that the way that these questions of intercurrent events are kind of addressed in a lot of grant application templates is very broadly things like, what challenges do you expect and what are you going to do about it? We kind of come up.
And everyone who's completed the CIHR RC randomized trial template knows that there's a section on, what are you going to do if things go wrong? How are you going to mitigate this? Gosh, that sounds kind of familiar now. We could refer to the, and subgroup planned subgroup analyses, right? And I always chafe at the square boxes that my round pegs are supposed to go into. And to a certain extent, this is maybe making those slightly changing a new set of square boxes. But on the other hand, having those square boxes and having people stop and think about what should I be putting in that box, because there's certainly good thinking that goes on when you specify a population carefully. There's really good thinking that goes on when you think, what do I mean by an intervention? And those of you who are also swimming in the observational study, observational research space, may recognize some of the thinking that's been going on in that space, where defining interventions extraordinarily carefully, almost exasperatingly carefully, is one of the key elements to establishing what is it I'm studying when I'm looking at an observational estimate of a treatment effect. Can I do it? I don't know. The notion of a target trial, which drives some clinical trial methodologists absolutely bananas. But there's a lot of shared thinking that I think that's going on there, and the two communities, if you will, I think they've been reinforcing each other, challenging each other to think more carefully about some of these things. Because as soon as intercurrent events happen, you're starting to creep from that idealized platonic clinical trial and moving towards something that is dealing with the fact that my original question has been not watered down, has been affected by the real world. And it becomes a little bit more observational. And as the number of things that go funny and go sideways increase, you're more and more likely to end up doing essentially observational research, though there was randomization at one point. So I think, yeah, this is not new stuff, not entirely new stuff, but it's a new emphasis. on different pieces of the puzzle. And yeah, I suspect that clinical trial templates, the ICH standardized template for a clinical trial, I think is going to start to incorporate some of these ideas, or incorporate the labels associated with these ideas in places where they're already strongly associated. That the right box is already there. It's just called a little bit differently. And because it's called a little bit differently, there's a tendency for some bleed in the ideas, which can lead to confusions. Yeah, that's
Yeah, and I think it's well taken, because I think when you frame it as what challenges are you expecting,
yeah,
we're thinking about like logistical problems, or
yeah,
what if I ran out of drug, or what have you.
yeah,
And in fact, some of the challenges are actually completely intrinsic to the disease we're studying. It cannot be avoided. Some of it is completely intrinsic into the trial design that we've chosen. Like if you're doing, like a step wedge approach, there are going to be temporal confounders. There's just
yeah,
no escaping that. If you are, looking at patients, with end-stage renal disease, some of them are going to go on dialysis. And so rather than consider those challenges, that's just sort of, as you put it, those are baked into the cake of the question itself. So it's a better way to frame it. There's another question in the chat here from Agri Devangi. I think he's getting at sort of the statistical uh, you know approach to these intercurrent events, and whether you would sort of treat them as interactions, if I'm interpreting that question correctly. I agree.
yeah. And please, I'll take a wild swing at this question. Part of it is part of the wildness will be because I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding what is meant by treated as an interaction. That's one of those words. A statistician says it and means a particular thing. You talk to a guy about protein-protein interactions, and they're talking about something completely different. And a social scientist is, again, something completely different. So a statistical interaction, that being effectively a usually it's a piece of a model that gets added to account for non-additive effects of uh, two other terms in a model. That actually, yeah, that could be part of the solution, part of the way of dealing with intercurrent events under some of those strategies for handling intercurrent events. Because I mean, interactions are often coupled with the idea of effect modification. And if you had an exogenous, an out of bad luck kind of event happen, and you wanted to say, well, look, I can evaluate the treatment effect in those who did not have that bad luck thing happen, and I can evaluate the treatment effect in the other group in which the bad luck event did happen. Now I might be looking at a treatment effect which is different with or without the presence of that bad luck thing. So yeah, an interaction might be a very reasonable way to address that. Um, Many of just as I was scanning the literature a little bit leading into this, there was a lot of talk about COVID, and COVID was an intercurrent event. Oh boy. And a lot of trials are struggling with how are we going to deal with the impact of COVID and all of the systemic changes that it introduced. If what we were doing was a 7-day course of antibiotics following an infection, okay, we're probably okay. COVID isn't a big deal. But if we're talking about a 5-year follow-up on a public health intervention or a mental health intervention, all of a sudden, COVID is the elephant in the room. And, gosh, it would have taken more foresight than I certainly have, but someone who said, how are we going to deal with what are we going to do with world events? And we're talking about, for example, depression and anxiety. Uh, well, gosh, there was an election in the States that kind of changed the landscape a bit. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with those kinds of events? Because certainly whether or not the patient got treated, whether or not they had cognitive behavioral therapy or standard of care is not related to whether or not election results in the States did or did not happen the way they did. But that's certainly going to play on some of the things that we're studying. How are we going to deal with that? And a really rigorous Estimand framework implementation of a trial design might have anticipated that sort of thing. And certainly the adoption, a clear statement of which strategy is intended, because that's gonna help shape a lot of the, even if you haven't specified the nitty-gritties of the way the analysis will have to change, specifying that you're going to adopt one of these strategies will mean that it's pretty clear that you actually did anticipate this kind of change being necessary, this kind of modeling being necessary to come to a fulsome understanding. And that's a lot of this is about, you have to yellow ball corner pocket, and you sink the ball in that pocket and people are impressed. You take a whack at the table and the red ball drops in the side pocket and you go, see, I can play pool. Well, I'm sorry, I don't know if that's pool or billiards I'm describing, but those things that happen that aren't precisely what you anticipated, they're often a little less impressive than things happening the way you said they might.
Mhm. Appreciate that. Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience?
I'm curious if there are any out there who have had experience with the Estimand framework, and especially if you're one of those people who does not adore them, or if you've sort of wrestled with that issue. Uh, I went to a meeting and heard some interesting presentations, and I could tell there were a couple of people in the audience who were just a little bit uncomfortable with the sort of fulsome praise for the Estimand framework that was being dished around. And I rode the train to Pearson with them, and just sort of eavesdropped on their conversation, with a big smile on my face, because I love hearing statisticians and methodologists argue. It's such fun. But they were just saying, we've got a bit of an issue here, and what are we going to do about it? And I think it was in the spirit of the putting lipstick on a pig doesn't change it. It's still a pig, and a floppy design is not going to be made better merely by putting words after each of those 5 questions. But they were, I think they were really concerned that some apparently rigorous sounding things will be happening, and they're really no more rigorous than they were before. Does that ring true with anybody?
I'm just going to say that for a trial that we just got funded through CIHR, which was like treatment A versus treatment B to prevent infections in cancer patients,
yeah,
we're using an Estimand framework. But when it went to CIHR, they were so confused that we had to almost have it translated so that the statisticians at CIHR would believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got it through to them, but it was part of the reasons why it got rejected first time around.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. We're about 5 years out from when the documents started being adopted by the regulatory agencies, and you can kind of understand that the regulatory agencies are the ones that are most concerned about just nailing things down. And this is, in a way, that's what this can serve to do. It can really help them nail things down. If you can answer those questions really clearly, they've got a good handle on what you're planning. Academic statisticians, on the other hand, are we're a bit more used to the loosey-goosey approach of, well, let's get a grad student to put the data into a spreadsheet and we'll see what happens. And that's my horror. But the adoption of the framework as part of a well-planned trial, I think it's going to take a little longer in the academic and the with the government agencies, the Tri-Council funding. I think we're going to find more and more statisticians, more and more clinical trialists are familiar with and comfortable with, and as they get comfortable with it, they'll realize its value, right? Anticipating that some of the patients are going to lose their kidneys and go on dialysis. What are we going to do with that? And they've been doing it all along. Like the kidney function literature is full of, what are we going to do with, end stage renal disease, hit 15? Okay, that's whether they're on dialysis or not, they probably should be. So what are we going to call that? What are we going to do with that in our analysis? They're already using the Estimand framework, anticipating that particular intercurrent event. And is it going to be a composite? Is it going to be all those things are being handled, but this is just making everybody sort of recognize that that was a really important step in our thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a good point, Jeannie. I think, even if you're using the Estimand framework in order to frame the question better, like to design a better trial, if people don't know that vocabulary, you're going to have to explain why you're phrasing it in a certain way. But hopefully the word will get out. Was not familiar with this framework until uh, Rob, you had introduced me to it, and I'm sure there are other people in the audience too who this will be the first time they've heard about this. So I appreciate your taking the time to get us oriented, and those who are participating in the discussion. I think it's been really helpful. We are at the hour, so we will wrap up and let people go about their days. Our next talk in a month is going to be Rena Buckstein speaking about strategies for assembling your research team, which I think would be a really interesting and potentially juicy topic for us to cover. But with that, we'll wrap up, and thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, well, thank you.